The water was bitter enough that grown men gagged on it, and yet the monks of Salerno kept drinking it on purpose every morning through the worst months of winter. Not because they enjoyed it, because the ones who drank it tended to survive the season when the ones who didn't. They had no idea why. They only knew the pattern, and they trusted the pattern more than they trusted comfort. That bitter cup was wormwood, and the story of how a plant nobody wanted to taste ended up saving lives across the ancient Mediterranean, and how its closest botanical cousin won a Nobel Prize in 2015, is one of the strangest, most quietly humbling stories in the history of medicine. Stay with me, because near the end, I'm going to tell you about a Chinese chemist who read a 1,600-year-old recipe so carefully that she noticed one word everyone else had skipped over. And that single word is the reason a malaria drug works today. Most people who reach for wormwood get the preparation exactly wrong, in a way that destroys the very thing they're reaching for. We'll get there. But first, let me put you somewhere. It is the 4th century, and you are standing on the deck of a grain ship somewhere between Alexandria and Ostia. The Mediterranean sun is merciless. Below deck, in the dark, the water barrels have been sitting for 3 weeks, and the men who drink from them are getting sick. Not the sharp, fast sickness of bad food, but the slow, wasting kind. Cramping, weight falling off them. The pallor that the ship's physician has learned to dread, because he knows what it means. There are worms in the gut, and there is no clean water within 1,000 miles to flush them out. So he does what every ship's physician in the ancient world had learned to do. He goes to the locked chest, and he takes out a bundle of grey-green leaves, dried and crumbling, that smells so bitter your eyes water just standing near them. Artemisia absinthium. Wormwood. The name itself tells you what it was for. Worm, wood. The plant against the worms. This was not folklore. This was the closest thing the ancient world had to a pharmacy, and wormwood sat near the front of the shelf. Wormwood enters the biblical story as the very image of bitterness. In Lamentations, the prophet says God has filled him with bitterness and made him drunk with wormwood. The taste of suffering so sharp the soul can barely hold it. In Revelation, a star called wormwood falls from heaven and turns 1/3 of the waters bitter, and many die from the waters because they were made bitter. Scripture reaches for this plant whenever it needs a word for something too harsh to swallow. And here is the thing that should stop you for a moment. That is botanically precise. Whoever first used wormwood as the literary symbol of unbearable bitterness was not reaching for a vague poetic flourish. They had tasted it. They knew. The metaphor works because the plant is real, and the reality of the plant is exactly as advertised. The bitterness in Scripture is not invented. It is reported. Now, why did it work? Because it did work, and the ancient record on this is remarkably consistent across cultures that had no reason to agree. Wormwood contains a class of compounds called sesquiterpene lactones, the most studied being absinthin and artemisinin. And these are intensely bitter molecules that the plant produces, in effect, as a chemical defense. Bitterness in the plant kingdom is very often a warning sign, a signal that says, "Do not eat me." But the human body, and the parasites living inside it, respond to that chemistry in different ways. These sesquiterpene compounds have demonstrated activity against intestinal parasites and a range of microbes in laboratory study. They appear to disrupt the parasites directly, and the intense bitterness itself does something the ancients couldn't have explained in molecular terms, but absolutely observed in practice. Bitter compounds on the tongue stimulate the release of digestive secretions, bile and stomach acid, the body's own first line of defense against what it swallows. The bitter plant provoked the gut into defending itself. The ancients didn't know about sesquiterpene lactomes. They knew that the bitter cup kept the worms away, and they were not wrong. But here is what almost no one mentions about wormwood, and it is the single most important thing in this entire video. So let me say it slowly. The active compounds in wormwood are not water-soluble in the way most herbal teas are, and more than that, they degrade. Sesquiterpene lactones are delicate. Boil wormwood hard or steep it long and hot the way you'd steep a black tea, and you do two things at once. You extract a flood of the harshest, most punishing bitterness, which is why people who try wormwood once usually never try it again. And you begin breaking down the very molecules you were after. The traditional European preparation, the one the monastery infirmaries used, was a short, gentle steep, a few minutes, no more, in water that had come off the boil and cooled slightly. Long enough to draw the medicine, not long enough to wreck it or to make the bitterness unbearable. The modern person who throws a fistful of wormwood into boiling water for 15 minutes is not making stronger medicine. They are making weaker medicine that tastes worse. They have inverted the entire thing. The ancients handled wormwood with restraint. That restraint was not timidity, it was technique. Let me take you to the place where that technique was preserved, when almost everything else was being lost. The early medieval monastery. Picture the infirmary at a Benedictine house somewhere in the Rhineland, the 9th or 10th century. The rule of St. Benedict commanded that the care of the sick be placed above and before every other duty, that the sick be served as if they were Christ himself. So the monks built gardens, physic gardens, infirmary gardens, and they grew, deliberately and with great care, the plants their texts told them healed. We know what they grew because they wrote it down. There is a famous 9th century plan drawn for the monastery of St. Gall that lays out the infirmary garden bed by bed, and the medicinal herbs are named. Wormwood is among them. These men were not peasants stumbling onto folk cures. They were literate, methodical, and they were copying and preserving the medical texts of Dioscorides and the Greeks across centuries, when those texts might otherwise have vanished entirely. Walk into that infirmary and the smell hits you first. Bitter and green and resinous, wormwood drying in bunches from the rafters alongside sage and rue and hyssop. There is a brother whose entire vocation is this room. He has read Dioscorides. He knows that wormwood is for the stomach, for the worms, for the fevers that come and go. And when a traveller arrives wasted and cramping from a long road, this is what he reaches for. Not because a star fell from heaven and made the waters bitter, because the book said so. And the book had been right before. That continuity, Greek physician to Roman ship to Benedictine garden to German pharmacopoeia, where wormwood was still officially listed into the 20th century, is more than 1,000 years of human beings watching the same plant do the same thing and writing it down for the next generation. Not in theory, in documented, continuous, practical use. Now I want to take you to the moment this whole story turns. Because for most of Western history, the connection between this bitter plant and the diseases of the gut and the fevers of the blood stayed exactly where the ancients left it. Observed, trusted, unexplained. The why remained sealed. And then it cracked open. And it cracked open not in Europe at all, but in China, in the middle of one of the most desperate medical situations of the 20th century. Here is the scene. It is 1969. The Vietnam War is raging, and soldiers on both sides are dying. Not only from bullets, but from malaria, a strain that had grown resistant to chloroquine, the drug the world had relied on. The parasite had outrun the medicine. North Vietnam asked China for help, and China launched a secret military research program, given the name of the date it began, Project 523. They put a young chemist named Tu Youyou in charge of one branch of it. Her assignment was almost absurd in scale. Go through traditional Chinese medicine, the accumulated herbal record of 2,000 years, and find something, anything, that might kill a parasite that modern pharmaceuticals could no longer touch. She and her team screened hundreds of traditional recipes, thousands of preparations, and one plant kept surfacing in the old texts for the treatment of intermittent fevers. The fevers that come and go, which is exactly how malaria announces itself. The plant was Qinghao, sweet wormwood, Artemisia annua, the close botanical cousin of the very same Artemisia the Romans carried in their ships and the monks grew in their gardens. The same genus, the same ancient reputation against the fevers and the things that live in the blood and the gut. But when Tu Youyou's team prepared it the obvious way, boiling it, extracting it with heat, the way you'd extract almost any herb, it barely worked. The results were weak, inconsistent. They nearly set it aside. And this is the part I promised you. This is the word everyone had skipped. Tu Youyou went back to the oldest source she could find, a text written by the physician Ge Hong around the year 340, a handbook of emergency prescriptions 16 centuries old. And the instruction for Qinghao did not say to boil it. It said to take the fresh plant, soak it in water, wring it out, and drink the juice. Cold. No fire at all. She read that, and she understood what the heat had been doing. The active compound was being destroyed by the very boiling everyone assumed was necessary. The ancient text had specified a cold preparation for a reason no one had bothered to honor. Because no one believed the old recipe could be more precise than modern method. So she switched to a low-temperature extraction, using ether, which pulls the compound out gently and cold. And it worked. Completely. The extract cleared the parasite from the blood. The compound she isolated is called artemisinin, and artemisinin-based therapy is, today, the frontline treatment for malaria across the world, and has saved millions of lives. In 2015, Tu Youyou received the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. She is the first mainland Chinese laureate in the sciences. And she said, plainly, that the key insight came from reading a 1,600-year-old text carefully enough to notice that it said cold, not hot. Sit with that for a moment. A delicate compound in a bitter Artemisia plant, destroyed by heat, preserved only by a gentle, cool preparation that the ancient world had written down and the modern world had ignored. Does that sound familiar? because it is the exact same lesson the Benedictine monks were quietly practicing with the European wormwood 1,000 years earlier. Short, cool steep, never a hard boil. Two traditions separated by the entire width of a continent with no contact between them, arriving independently at the same conclusion about the same family of plants. Handle it gently. Keep it cool. The medicine is in there, but it is fragile, and fire takes it away. That is not coincidence. That is two sets of people watching carefully over many generations, converging on a truth that was sitting in the chemistry the whole time, waiting for someone to explain it in molecular terms. That is not symbolism. In modern terms, specifically in what pharmacology now understands about the thermal instability of sesquiterpene compounds, Gerhong's cold water instruction from the year 340 is a precise chemical protocol. He could not have told you what a sesquiterpene endoperoxide bridge was. The molecular structure of artemisinin would not be described until the 1970s. But he knew that fire ruined the cure, and he wrote it down so carefully that the instruction survived 16 centuries intact, and changed modern medicine when someone finally read it the way he meant it to be read. The people in that story were not guessing. They had compressed centuries of careful observation into a single line of text. And the line was right. Now let me bring this all the way back to your kitchen, honestly and carefully, because wormwood is not a casual herb, and I will not pretend otherwise. This is a potent plant, and it deserves respect, not enthusiasm. Wormwood contains a compound called thujone, which in large amounts is genuinely neurotoxic. This is the real chemistry behind the old fears around absinthe, the wormwood liquor of 19th century Paris. In small, brief, traditional amounts, the risk is low, but the margin is not enormous, and that changes how you use it. If you are going to use wormwood at all, the traditional preparation is a 1/4 teaspoon of dried leaf, no more, in water that has come off the boil, steeped for around 5 minutes only. Never a long, hard simmer, both because extended steeping destroys the delicate compounds and because it pulls more thujone into the cup. 1 cup, and not as a daily habit you carry on for months. It was used as a short corrective course, the way the ship's physician used it, for a defined problem, for a limited time. The intense bitterness was traditionally softened with a slice of fresh ginger and a small amount of raw honey, which is also why these were kept together. And here is who must not touch it at all. Not during pregnancy, under any circumstances. Wormwood has a long documented history as a plant that can threaten a pregnancy, and that history is taken seriously for good reason. Not if you are breastfeeding. Not if you have a seizure disorder because of the thujone. Not alongside medications without speaking to a doctor who knows your full picture. And if you have persistent digestive symptoms, weight loss, or a fever that comes and goes, the very things wormwood was historically reached for, that is precisely when you do not self-treat with a bitter herb. That is when you see a physician, because those same symptoms are how serious illness announces itself. And the ancient world lost plenty of people who guessed wrong. The honest position is the one the best of the old physicians would have taken. This is a real tool for a narrow purpose, used briefly and carefully. And it is not a substitute for a doctor when something is actually wrong. So let me name the thing that connects all of it, because I think it is bigger than any single plant. The discovery underneath this entire story is that the ancient instruction was often more precise than we assumed, and that our confidence in modern method made us deaf to it. We looked at a 1,600-year-old recipe that said cold water, and we assumed we knew better and boiled it, and we nearly threw away a Nobel Prize. The bitterness of wormwood, which scripture used as the very symbol of what cannot be swallowed, turned out to be the plant's chemistry announcing itself honestly. This is medicine, it said, and medicine is not always sweet. What industrial processing destroyed here is not a vitamin or a mineral. It is the gentleness. The modern instinct is to extract harder, heat hotter, standardize, concentrate. And the lesson of artemisinin is that the harder you push, the more of the real thing you can lose. A handful of fresh, sweet wormwood, wrung cold into a cup of water by a Chinese physician in the 4th century, contained more usable medicine than the same plant boiled to death in a modern lab. The difference between those two cups is the difference between reading the recipe and assuming you already knew it. And I want to honor the people who wrote those recipes down, not romantically, but with plain respect. They did not have a laboratory. They had something else. Generations of human beings watching what happened to other people, recording it faithfully, and trusting the record enough to preserve a single word, cold, not hot, across 16 centuries until someone was finally ready to understand why it mattered. That is not superstition. That is data, gathered the slow way, by people who paid attention. So here is the question I want to leave you holding, the one I suspect you'll still be turning over tomorrow. If the difference between a useless extract and a world-saving medicine came down to a 4-century-old instruction that everyone could read and almost everyone ignored, how many other instructions are sitting in the old texts right now, written plainly, waiting? Not lost, not secret, just unheard, because we were too certain we already knew better to read them carefully. What else is written down in plain sight that we have simply stopped reading closely enough to understand? If this kind of conversation matters to you, hit like and subscribe, and share this with someone in your life who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me which part surprised you most. I read every single one. New content every week. We are just getting started.